Hey everyone. I'm so excited to be speaking with you at TypeWknd and thankful for such an encouraging and wonderful online conference developed pretty quickly, so I'm happy to be here with everyone. My name is Kaleb Dean. I own a branding studio called Pen and Lens. I teach at the university level, and most recently I've been live streaming type and other forms of design on Twitch under the pseudonym Akimbo.black. Now, you're watching this to learn about what I'm calling the spacing calculator. It's a long and winding story with trials, tribulations, and at the end, some really exciting triumphs in the name of typography, right? Guys, I'm really pumped. But I did develop this while streaming online. That's like all the math, all the trial and error, all the data entry, really terrible. So I do feel the need to be honest to that audience and do this presentation in that sort of format. So sit back, don't run away, and when you see some math equations, we'll power through, and at the end, we'll look at some beautifully spaced type. So let's get started. Since I've been streaming, I've developed just about two typefaces. The first one called Harvo, and the second one called Kaylee. Now, if any of you design typefaces, which I'm assuming most of you do, or if you're thinking about it, in which case, just do it. You know that spacing really makes or breaks a font. So when I inevitably came to spacing on stream, I sort of embarrassingly had to tell everybody that, in fact, I had no idea how to space a font. None, not even a guess. Like, I just straight up Googled it while on stream. But one of the first resources that I turned to was Designing Type by Karen Cheng, right? Any type designer should be looking at this book. If you're not, I encourage you to look at it. I show it to many of my students throughout the year. And one of the things that I learned immediately is that spacing is based off of two measurements, the capital H and the lowercase n. Now, some basics is that you take the inner width of either the H or the N. We'll use the H, for example. And using the inner space of the H, you sort of set a couple H's next to each other. And you decide that you want the upright stems of your H's to look like they're in an even rhythm. Not too tight, not too loose, sort of the Goldilocks, sort of in between, so you have a nice rhythm. And then you take your middle H and you replace it with an O, and you do the same thing. So you space it back and forth, you change what's going on until you get a really beautifully spaced H-O-H. And then you add a whole bunch more letters and you figure that rhythm out until you have this really beautiful rhythm that's like music across the page, right? We sort of know that as type designers, that we're looking for that music look. And then you do the same thing with the lowercase n, and you should be able to apply that rhythm to all of your characters across the board, right? In Cheng's examples, she breaks down the H and O and lowercase n and lowercase o for us in Universe and Garamond, and then she gives us a sort of formula, which is an adaptation of Walter Tracy's work for how to space a main alphabet. And it looks a little bit like this. She says that the number 1 should be equal to the side bearing of H. Number 2 should be slightly less than the side bearing of the H. Okay, that's a little vague, right? Slightly less. 10% off a loaf of bread is not that much off, but a 10% dip in the stock market is a big dip, right? So slightly is a little vague. We have half the side bearing. That one's clear, right? Okay, I know what my H is, so I can cut it in half, no big deal. For the minimum side bearing, minimum could be a lot, right? Like, is it 1 point smaller? Is it 99 points smaller? Who knows? A 5 is equal to the side bearing of the O. Okay, well, we figured that out earlier, right? And then there was an asterisk. 4 must be visually adjusted. What? What? How vague, right? It feels like a John Cage or a Yoko Ono prompt. And then we're supposed to apply it to the alphabet like this slide here, where you take the number 1, which was equal to the side bearing of H, and apply it where all the number 1s are. Number 2, which is slightly less, apply it where all the number 2s are, and so on and so forth. So pretty much if you had one measurement wrong, then you were like wrong in many, many places, or you put up a bunch of letters together and you were just treating the whole alphabet like one of 5 measurements, which didn't seem like enough. But like I said, I was totally new at spacing, so I just went for it. There's a similar font or a similar formula, rather, for the lowercase n. We have the equal to left side bearing equal to the right, right? So now they're different because the n has a shoulder on one side and a serif on the other. And then there's slightly more, which is really vague. And then minimum side bearing, again, we have minimum. Like, is that 0? 0 is a minimum. Negative 50 is a minimum. But you're just like, what? I don't really know. And then we have equal to and slightly less than, and then, of course, must be visually adjusted, right? Guys, like I said, regardless of my doubt, I went for it, all in. And honestly, when I spaced my fonts, they weren't too bad. It worked. It largely worked. I would never use them to set them in text. This is Kaylee here, but not bad. There's some poor spacing behind the F. There's too much spacing behind the front of the lowercase t. The A and the V have a lot of work that need to be done. Basically, I have to, manually adjust every single letter form, which I sort of expected, but maybe not after following a formula that seemed precise, right? But most importantly is to be learning from what we're doing. So what I learned from Cheng's text was that there were proportions and ratios involved in spacing business, right? This needs to equal that, and this space is half of that space. And my brain was intrigued. I thought, those things are just percentages of the inner space. So if you could input inner space and pull a percentage out of it, then you would get a precise number, right? And the beauty of percentages is that it doesn't matter if you're using points or picas or bits or ems or whatever it is that GIFs uses. 67% is 67%. And thus, I had an idea. Guys, it was a great idea. It made my stream come to life, and it also meant that I had to do a lot of data entry and some math. So I needed first a data set to figure out this idea, okay? I started with sans serif with foresight to a more complicated issue, which we'll talk about in a minute. I studied 7 different fonts, some that did heavy lifting, some that we see all over the web like Roboto and Open Sans, and others from contemporary type foundries that have found a ton of popularity. And I input the side bearings for each. So basically, I just opened up their glyphs, their files and glyphs. I own the licenses for all of them, have paid for them, and made just documented what was going on in the typeface. Then I divided the side bearing by the inner space accordingly to get a percent. And that equation looked like this. I have that BS there, which is bearing side. It's not S for side bearing. You'll find out why in a little bit. Over the N, I'm using lowercase n for inner space. It could have been capital H for the capitals. I used a different measurement for the different letter forms. So all of the lowercase are measured using the lowercase n, as suggested, and all of the uppercase are made using the inner space of the capital H, as suggested. And all of those gave me an average bearing. So I'd get an average bearing for, say, one of the typefaces. And then, because I had 7 of them, I'd add all the average bearings together, all 7 of them, and then divide them by 7 to get an average percent of inner space proportion, right? So I had my average. And then all I had to do was apply those percentages to my letter forms, right? I just input an inner space, and bada bing, bada boom, I've got it. But that math looks like this, right? My 2B side bearing was the inner space times my average side bearing. And what I got was this beautifully precise spreadsheet. Guys, it's massive, it's sometimes oppressive, and it's gorgeous. It looks like this. On the left here, I have my output, and on the right of this line, I have the fonts I studied. At the top, I have inputs for things I need to measure, the inner space of the lowercase n and the inner space of the capital H. And I can input any measurement here on the top where it says inner space, and it'll output side bearings for all my letter forms. For example, if I put in 100, you can see all my letters get a value. And I can change it to anything. 647 inner space, side bearings. 1,298, boom, side bearings. 1,652,009, okay, you get it. And once I entered the data into the spacing calculator, it gave me this. On the left here, you can see the design type formula, and on the right, you can see the spacing calculator 1.0. And it's pretty good, right? Like, on the right, you can see it's a little bit more even, it's a little bit tighter. Here, I'll set it in red for you. The red is design type, the white is the new text, and now you can see really where the changes are. The spacing calculator is quite a bit tighter, it has a more even rhythm, and guys, it felt really good to set a typeface that I had designed live on stream in a paragraph that looked this good, right? But I knew, as I said before, that there were going to be some trials and tribulations ahead, and that's why I hadn't done any of the spacing for Harvo yet, because of the one road bump, serifs. Oh, guys, here's a roadblock. Of course, serifs have to complicate the system, right? Because it's math-based, not visually based, right? When glyphs is measuring side bearings, it measures it from the furthest most point. So serifs would get in the way. What I wanted to do was space via the stems, and glyphs wanted to space via math. Fortunately, this spreadsheet and this calculator is already taking in measurements, and I noticed how Karen Cheng's measuring her space in the Garamond example, which is basically ignoring the serifs, which in math terms is subtracting the serifs. So, we went back to the math board, and our last formula looked like this, right? Well, that was going to change. And now we need a different averaging formula to start. So I pulled in 7 more fonts, this time fonts with serifs. And to pull out the visual side bearing, it's as simple as adding the serif to the bearing on the side and equaling what I'm calling a bearing Roman, which is the calculated side bearing plus the serif. That's why we didn't use S in side bearing, because we needed to use S in serif. And then with the same math in mind as last time, I pulled out the ratio with a proportion. We started our first ones with the side bearing over the inner space of the lowercase n or h to get an average. And now we're taking the width of the serif into consideration. So our side bearing plus the width of our serif, and I'm only taking in one measurement, assuming that all typefaces have the equal serif. So it's bearing plus serif divided by our inner space, which is very similar, just a hair different, right? And then to get our typeface back, or to keep our brains a little simple, we just named it bearing Roman over our inner space. So to average again, I add 7 together, divide by 7, got an average percent for each letter form, the side of each letter form. And then to add it back into my font or any font, which is the beauty of this, I had to make sure to ignore the serif there too. So by applying these percentages to my letter forms, I took an equation that looked a little bit like this, which is now my inner space times my average. Again, this is my average Roman that I'm calling, and minus that serif width. So we have to subtract it the same way that Karen Cheng did in her book, and the same way that other typographers do when they're spacing type, right? Which would look similar to our first one, but with the addition of serifs. So again, the serif is the only change here. And now, some of you who are thinking ahead might realize that the letters like O, C, G, D, and B, and some other lowercase and some other uppercase, don't have serifs affected by one side, right? The curve of the C and the O and the G, D and the B, none of those are affected by the serifs. But we already have that measurement, right? We already have a spreadsheet with the serif measurements or the sans serif measurements rather, in our first spacing calculator, which means that for Spacing Calculator 2.0, I combined the first two to create a more robust serif and sans serif calculator. Here, the gray boxes show the use of sans serif formulas and averages, and the black boxes show the use of serif formulas and averages. Basically, I'm combining the equations here and the math here to get to one spreadsheet output. And again, guys, let's look at this outcome. Oh, they are so satisfying to me as a beginning type designer. They're really, really wonderful. Here, Harveau and Kaleb are spaced with the new calculator. It's probably worth noting that Harveau isn't a normal serif font either, and yet the calculator gave it a pretty satisfying color in both its modern and its grotesque versions. These fonts take the average spacing in industry-leading typefaces and come to a result for each individual character, where the formulas from design type only used 4 or 5 numbers. This one takes every single letter form, the sides of every single letter form, and averages it. And I think that's a pretty specific and pretty successful thing, especially since we as type designers are going to do that anyways. Why not give ourselves a more powerful tool? And note again that I haven't kerned or anything. So I haven't kerned either of these letter forms. I'm not making any individual changes. This is just raw spacing, guys. I'll keep the slide here for a moment because I think you need to indulge just a little bit. Okay, come back to me. So that's the story and math of the spacing calculator. I'd like to thank you all before we join Q&A for putting up with the math through the middle there and the sort of experimental presentation style. I hope it didn't make you dizzy or sick, but I'm grateful for your time that you invested listening to this talk. I might be a little obsessive about type, but I think that's what makes a good type designer. I'll let you be the judge of that. Thank you again. I'm looking forward to seeing you and hearing from you in our Q&A.